Tonight we drift into the hush of Venice, the floating city where stone palaces seem to hover on water, and where the moon glitters across canals like spilled silver. You're not here as a wealthy visitor leaning back in a cushioned seat, you're the one balancing on the stern of a long, narrow gondola, pole pressed against the dark water, guiding strangers through the labyrinth of glistening waterways. The soft splash of your oar echoes off brick walls older than your ancestors, and though it looks serene from the outside, you already know, this job is equal parts performance, endurance, and survival. And, let's be honest, you probably wouldn't last a week doing it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The night wraps around you like a velvet cloak, heavy with the smell of brine, damp stone, and faint perfume drifting from shuttered balconies above. A lantern swings at the prow of your gondola, glowing gold against the black canal, while your arms ache from the steady rhythm of rowing. It's no easy thing to stand on the stern of a boat built deliberately asymmetrical, one side wider than the other, so that it glides in a straight line when you push against the water. If the boatwrights hadn't designed it that way, you'd be zigzagging across the canal like a drunk crab. Historians still argue whether the earliest gondolas were this skewed or whether that clever tweak came later, when Venetian traffic jams became an actual problem. Tonight, though, the canal isn't crowded. A late couple sits in your boat, nobles by the looks of their velvet cloaks, though you've learned not to assume too much. Sometimes, the richest silks cover debts big enough to sink a ship. They whisper behind their masks, giggling like conspirators, and you catch the occasional word, doge, banquet, betrayal. Gondoliers joke that you're the city's unofficial archivists, hearing more state secrets than half the Senate, though you know better than to repeat them. A loose tongue can cost you more than your job, it can cost you your teeth, or worse, a permanent swim in the lagoon. You steer past the Rialto, its white arches pale in the moonlight. From here, Venice feels eternal. The murmur of water, the creak of wood, the rhythmic slap of waves against foundations sunk deep into mud centuries ago. But you also notice small details: plaster crumbling, a shutter hanging loose, the smell of sewage wafting from an alley. It's not all romance. Sometimes, when tourists sigh at the beauty of it all, you want to hand them a bucket and say, "Fine, you keep this afloat for a day." Still, there's beauty in your work, even if it's hard-earned. You've learned to shift your weight so smoothly it looks like you're hardly moving at all, balancing with a dancer's poise on the little platform at the stern. The oar doesn't just push, you twist it, let it bite into the current, and pull back so the gondola turns like a blade sliding between ribs. That flourish, that effortless elegance, is what passengers pay for, even if they don't realize it. Somewhere above, a window opens. A young woman tosses a basin of wash water straight into the canal, nearly hitting your prow. You mutter something unrepeatable under your breath. Venice might look like marble and music, but half the time it smells like laundry water and yesterday's fish. That's the secret no postcard ever tells you. The couple steps out near a little bridge, coins clinking in your hand, and you watch them vanish into the maze of alleyways. Now you're alone with the night again. You lean on your oar, listening. A distant fiddle drifts across the water, accompanied by the occasional drunken shout. A dog barks from a stone courtyard, echoing against walls. And above it all, bells begin to toll from a distant campanile, midnight sliding into morning one slow peal at a time. There's always a moment, in these hours, when you wonder how long Venice will last. The Republic feels powerful, its fleets ruling the Adriatic, its merchants swaggering across Europe, but you've heard whispers: the Ottomans pressing in, the Dutch stealing trade, the Spanish plotting. Some say Venice is fading, its glory slipping away like sand through fingers. Others insist the lagoon protects her, that no army can march across water. Historians still argue whether the city's decline truly began in your century or whether that's just hindsight talking. For you, standing barefoot on wet planks, it hardly matters. The rent still needs paying, and your boat still needs repairs. You steer back toward the quieter canals, the ones locals use rather than tourists. Here, shadows deepen, and the air smells of salt and damp brick. You pass under a low arch, ducking your head, your lantern painting golden ripples along the ceiling. The silence is nearly perfect until a rat skitters along the edge of the canal, pauses to glare at you like a landlord demanding rent, then disappears into a crack. You sigh. Even the rats in Venice have more attitude than is reasonable. Finally, you guide the gondola back toward the mooring where you'll tie it up until dawn. The rope is rough in your hand, the wood beneath your feet slick with algae. You secure the knot, stretch your aching shoulders, and glance once more at the black water. In the moonlight, it looks bottomless, as if it could swallow whole palaces without a trace. And perhaps one day it will. But for tonight, you're still afloat, still earning, still breathing the damp Venetian air. Tomorrow will come with bread, bells, and the weight of another day, but for now, you take in the quiet, and let the city rock you toward rest. The bells drag you out of sleep before the sun does. You blink in the dim light of your cramped little room, walls sweating with lagoon damp, and hear the peal echo across rooftops. Venice wakes with a clamor that's both majestic and irritating. Majestic if you're a visitor marveling at the soundscape of history, irritating if you're a gondolier with aching arms and not nearly enough hours of rest. You groan, pull yourself up from your straw-stuffed mattress, and shuffle to the window where a slice of canal glimmers, already busy with boats. The first thing you notice isn't the water, though it's the smell. Warm, yeasty air rolls in from the nearby bakery. Bread is life in Venice, though grain has always been tricky to source. The Republic, clever as ever, built an entire bureaucracy around importing wheat, storing it in massive granaries, and keeping loaves affordable for ordinary folk like you. Historians still argue whether this was genuine concern for the people or just a shrewd way to avoid riots. Whatever the case, your stomach doesn't care. You tug on your striped shirt, still damp from yesterday's labor, and make your way down the narrow steps toward that smell of salvation. The bakery's queue snakes along the calle, people grumbling in 3 languages at once. Venice, perched between east and west, is a city of mingling tongues: Italian, Greek, German, even a splash of Arabic here and there. You stand in line, hair uncombed, posture slouched, and no one bats an eye. Everyone looks half asleep. When you finally clutch that warm loaf, crust crisp, center steaming, you tear into it before you even step outside. Breakfast isn't a feast for a gondolier, it's survival. Bread, maybe a scrap of cheese if fortune smiles, and coffee if you're rich or reckless. Yes, coffee. The drink still feels new, still debated in whispers. Some say it's a devil's brew, others insist it's a miracle that keeps Venetians upright after too many late-night revels. The first coffee houses here sprang up in the 17th century, and by your time they're thriving. You think about it, pocket already light with yesterday's meager earnings, and sigh. Better to stick with bread. Coffee will have to wait for carnival tips or a particularly generous tourist. Back on the street, the morning air hums with motion. Water carriers trudge with heavy buckets, laundry hangs like flags between windows, and dogs nose around for scraps. A vendor hawks oranges, his voice echoing off stone, while another peddles cheap trinkets from a tray. Venice never really sleeps, but morning brings a new tempo, brisk and sharp compared to the dreamy rhythm of midnight canals. You pass other gondoliers gathering near the traghetto stands, those spots where gondolas serve as makeshift ferries, shuttling people back and forth across the Grand Canal for a penny or two. The older ones swap jokes, their voices rough like sandpaper, while the younger men stretch as though limbering up for a contest. There's always a contest, even if no one says it out loud. Who can steer the straightest line? Who gets the best fares? Who sings the sweetest? Rivalry hangs in the air as thick as morning mist. You nod to a few familiar faces, but keep walking. A quirky thing about gondoliers, your license isn't just handed to you. It's inherited, like an heirloom. Families guard these privileges fiercely, passing them from father to son, uncle to nephew, and occasionally selling them when desperate. Historians still argue whether this system kept standards high or merely bred corruption. You just know it means that every gondolier you meet is tangled in family histories thicker than fishing nets. You yourself were lucky or unlucky, depending on the day, to inherit yours. By now, your loaf is nearly gone, crumbs sticking to your shirt. You pause on a small bridge, chewing, and watch the canal below fill with activity. A fruit barge noses past, piled high with figures. A laundry boat drifts by, carrying clotheslines heavy with sheets fluttering in the breeze. Somewhere down the canal, a boy sings, his voice cracking but enthusiastic. Venice in the morning isn't the romantic vision painted in travel books. It's loud, messy, crowded, and very much alive. You make your way back to your moored gondola, tied beside others in a chaotic row. The boats bob against one another, their black hulls gleaming, prows adorned with the familiar iron comb-shaped ornament, the ferro, whose 6 forward prongs, they say, represent the 6 sisteri of the city. That story may be more tourist bait than truth, but it sounds impressive enough to repeat. A gull squawks overhead, landing boldly on the gondola ahead of yours, where it immediately attempts to steal a piece of bread from the bow. You glare, half amused, half annoyed, and shoo it away. Even the birds here act like they own the canals. Climbing aboard, you balance easily now, though your first days were filled with slips, curses, and more than one unwanted swim. The boat rocks gently, water slapping against its sides, and you take a long breath. The day has begun, the canals are filling, and soon you'll be out there again, ferrying passengers who expect romance while you sweat under the sun. For now, though, you savor the pause, the bread's last crumb dissolving on your tongue, the bells still echoing faintly in the air, and the certainty that, in Venice, every day begins not with quiet dignity but with clatter, gossip, and the warm embrace of bread. Your arms stretch as you take up the oar, and the gondola lurches forward like a stubborn mule deciding whether it feels like cooperating today. If you've never handled one of these boats, let me tell you, they are deceptively awkward creatures. Long and narrow, with a deliberate tilt to one side, the gondola doesn't so much glide as it sulks, demanding endless coaxing to stay on course. The first time you tried, you zigzagged across the canal like a drunk eel, crashing into walls, barges, and, at one humiliating moment, the laundry pole of an irate grandmother. She chased you with a slipper, and honestly, you can still feel the sting. Now, though, the motion is second nature. You shift your weight to counter the boat's lopsided design, plant the oar into the forcola, your wooden oarlock carved with elegant notches, and push. The trick isn't brute strength. It's rhythm. It's knowing how to twist the blade just so that the water pulls you straight instead of spinning you around like a carnival ride. Historians still argue whether the asymmetry was introduced in the 16th or 17th century, but all you know is that without it, Venice would be a bumperboat lagoon, with gondoliers colliding like clumsy jousters every 5 minutes. You navigate into the broader Grand Canal, the morning sun finally cutting through the mist. Palazzi line the banks like a painted stage set, their Gothic arches and Renaissance windows reflecting off the greenish water. You'd think rowing through this grandeur would make you feel majestic, but instead you're dodging delivery boats, avoiding water taxis, and keeping an eye on the bratty apprentices who steer with all the grace of a cow on ice. Someone yells an insult from a rival gondola, and you throw one back, the words flowing as easily as the current. Venetian gondoliers are fluent in sarcasm, it's practically part of the job description. Passengers rarely notice how much muscle and calculation go into keeping them afloat. They lean back on the cushions, sigh about the romance, and maybe toss you a coin if they're feeling generous. What they don't see are the hours of training that turned your arms into ropes of sinew, the calluses that never soften, or the careful balance that means one wrong step could send both you and them tumbling into water that smells like yesterday's fish stew. You sometimes wonder if anyone outside your trade truly respects it, or if they just see you as a moving prop in their Venetian daydream. There's one quirky tradition that always makes newcomers laugh: gondolas are painted black. Not by accident, not by fashion, but by law. In earlier centuries, the boats came in every color, painted with extravagant designs and gold leaf until they looked more like floating jewelry boxes than working vessels. The ruling council, tired of the excess, decreed uniform black to curb the flamboyance. Did it work? Well, sort of. The boats might all be black now, but gondoliers found other ways to strut through striped shirts, colorful sashes, and, let's be honest, pure attitude. A small challenge rises as you steer past a crowded traghetto stand. One boat cuts too close, forcing you to twist your oar sharply and rock the gondola at a dangerous angle. The passengers squeal, yes, squeal as though they've narrowly escaped death. You bite back a grin. If they knew how often this happens, they'd realize they were never really in danger. Still, you milk it a little, letting them think you've just pulled off a daring rescue. A bigger tip never hurts. Beyond the practical, there's poetry in the work. The gondola doesn't just move, you guide it like a dancer guiding a partner. Every shift of weight, every stroke of the oar, every subtle lean part of a long, silent conversation between human and wood. Sometimes, when the canal clears and you drift beneath a quiet bridge, you almost forget the aching muscles and the endless bills. The gondola glides forward, slicing through mirrored water, and for a breathless moment, you feel like you and the city are one. Then, of course, someone on shore dumps chamber pot water into the canal, and the spell is broken. Venice keeps you humble. Historians still argue whether gondoliers were ever considered noble servants or simply glorified boatmen. You suspect it's both. You're a servant, yes, but one who moves among senators, princes, and visiting ambassadors. Your boat is both stage and confessional. From your stern, you glimpse lives ordinary folk never touch. It doesn't make you rich, but it does make you indispensable. And in Venice, being indispensable counts for more than it seems. As the sun climbs higher, sweat beads at your temples. The canals grow busier, and every stroke of the oar feels heavier. But you don't falter. You've tamed the gondola, this stubborn, beautiful beast, and in doing so, you've claimed a place in the endless rhythm of the city. You push, twist, pull, glide, and even as your body aches, there's a flicker of pride. No tourist, no noble, no senator could step onto this stern and do what you do without making a fool of themselves. And that knowledge, quiet and steady, keeps you rowing through the shimmering Venetian morning. You tug at your striped shirt as the sun climbs higher, the fabric sticking to your back where sweat has already claimed territory. The gondolier's wardrobe may look like something dreamed up by a lazy theater costume designer, but it's both practical and steeped in centuries of habit. The black boat is your stage, and your body, well, that's half the spectacle. Tourists swoon at the sight of a man in crisp stripes and a straw hat steering through canals, as if you were born to serenade. You, meanwhile, know the truth. The stripes hide stains, the hat shields your eyes from the glare, and the red sash doubles as a handy towel when the lagoon sprays your face. Historians still argue whether the iconic striped shirt dates back to the 18th century proper, or if it settled into uniformity later, in the 19th. Either way, you wear it now, and no one questions it. The straw boater, perched lightly on your head, is less about tradition than survival. Without it, the midday sun bakes you like a loaf in one of those ovens you smelled this morning. And the shoes? Soft, worn leather with soles thin enough to grip the gondola's slick planks but sturdy enough to stand all day without your feet collapsing in rebellion. Every gondolier, though, has a bit of individuality hidden in plain sight. Some tuck little charms into their hats, talismans against bad weather or bad luck. Others stitch secret pockets into their sashes for extra coins or folded notes. You've got one, too, though you'll never admit what's inside. It's not coins, not maps, but a folded scrap of paper with a joke written by a friend who drowned years ago. A reminder that the canal gives, but it also takes, and that laughter is lighter to carry than grief. As you steer down a quieter canal, you catch your reflection in the rippling water. Striped shirt, straw hat, scarred hands gripping the oar. It's a uniform, yes, but it's also an identity. Gondoliers are recognized instantly, even from a distance. You're more than a ferryman, you're part of the city's visual language, as much a symbol as the bridges and bells. Of course, that doesn't stop children from mocking your stripes by running around in kitchen aprons tied across their chests, pretending to row with broomsticks. You've chased a few of those little rascals off docks before, laughing even as you threatened to toss them into the lagoon. Fashion in Venice is never just about utility. Nobles drape themselves in brocades, women swish in gowns heavy enough to anchor a gondola, and even apprentices sport jaunty caps to look important. Gondoliers, though, balance function with showmanship. Your wardrobe has to survive sweat, water, grease from quick meals, and the occasional pigeon deciding your hat is its new toilet. Yet it also has to impress passengers who expect you to embody Venice itself. You're an actor in their romantic fantasy, whether you like it or not. There's one fringe tale about gondoliers in your era that some wore ribbons of secret colors to signal allegiance to certain noble families or political factions. Whether it's true or not, you sometimes tie a ribbon of your own, not for politics but for the girl who sells figs near your mooring. She laughed the first time she noticed, calling you foolish, but you've kept doing it anyway. Little gestures matter, even if no one else sees them. A rival gondolier passes you now, his stripes brighter, his hat tilted at a more rakish angle. He gives you a smirk, the kind that says, "My passengers tipped me more than yours." You roll your eyes but secretly smooth your sash and adjust your hat. Vanity, like the tide, is impossible to escape in Venice. And why not? You're standing upright on water, balancing a 40-foot vessel with one oar. If that's not worth a little strut, what is? The sun burns hotter, reflecting off pale stone, and you're grateful for the shade of your brim. A gust of breeze lifts your shirt just enough to cool your skin, and for a moment you feel oddly content. The uniform might itch, the sash might tighten, but together they make you part of something larger than yourself, a centuries-old fraternity of men who learned to turn striped cloth, straw, and sweat into living symbols of Venice. And then, of course, a pigeon swoops low, aiming directly for your hat. You duck, nearly lose balance, and hear laughter from a balcony above. The city never lets you take yourself too seriously. Good thing, too, striped shirt or not, straw hat or not, you're still just a man rowing through the mess and beauty of Venice, trying to look stylish while sweating buckets. Your gondola drifts along, and soon enough you're no longer alone with your thoughts. The day's first real passengers arrive, a couple of wide-eyed travelers clutching a guidebook thicker than a brick and pointing at every bridge as though it's the eighth wonder of the world. You welcome them aboard with a practiced smile, steadying the gondola as they wobble their way in like untrained ducks. They settle into the cushions with sighs of relief, and just like that, you become more than a ferryman. You're a confidant, a performer, sometimes even an unwilling therapist. People spill their lives into gondolas the way they might into a church confessional. The water, the motion, the strange intimacy of drifting together, it loosens tongues. Nobles whisper about debts, merchants boast about fortunes, and young lovers cling to each other like they'll drown if they let go. You don't ask for their secrets, but you hear them all the same. Historians still argue whether gondoliers ever acted as informal spies, selling overheard gossip to the government, and while no one admits it outright, you know very well a few colleagues who always seem suspiciously well fed for men who row so little. The couple in your boat now are harmless enough. They point to palaces and ask whether that's where Casanova once held court. You shrug, offer a vague perhaps, and let them imagine it so. Truth doesn't matter much in these canals. What matters is the story. And Venetians are experts at weaving stories, even if half of them are stitched from lies and wishful thinking. Some passengers, though, are unforgettable. Like the foreign ambassador who tried to bribe you into steering him to a clandestine meeting, all while pretending not to sweat through his embroidered coat. Or the noblewoman who slipped her mask aside just long enough to cry silently as the gondola rocked gently, her husband trailing in another boat, none the wiser. Then there was the German tourist who asked if the canals froze solid in winter and whether you used your gondola as a sled. You told him, with a straight face, that yes, Venetians race gondolas down icy canals like horses at carnival. He nodded, impressed. You still chuckle about that. There's a quirky superstition you've noticed. Many passengers toss coins into the water, whispering wishes as if the lagoon were a bottomless wishing well. The truth is, most of those coins vanish into muck or into the pockets of boys who dive for them. But the tradition persists. Maybe it's the spell of the city, or maybe people just like the feeling of giving something back to the water that carried them. Not every passenger is pleasant, of course. Some haggle shamelessly over fares, as if you're selling stale bread instead of navigating 40 feet of timber through unpredictable canals. Others complain that the water smells, well, yes, it does. It's a lagoon, not a perfumed bath. And sometimes you get drunks who think singing bawdy songs at the top of their lungs makes them charming. You've learned to nod, smile, and row faster when that happens. Yet, despite the annoyances, there's magic in watching people see Venice for the first time from the water. Their eyes widen as you slip under a bridge, shadows wrapping them in mystery. They laugh nervously as another gondola passes so close their fingers could touch. They sigh as the city unfolds like a stage set, marble and brick rising straight from the water as if floating. In those moments, you almost forgive them their clumsiness and their endless questions. Once, late at night, you ferried a poet who sat silently the whole journey, scribbling notes in a little book. He never spoke a word, just nodded at the end and handed you a coin heavy enough to make your eyes widen. Weeks later, you heard a recitation in a tavern, and the verses sounded hauntingly familiar. The gondola had become a poem. You wondered if your rowing was immortalized in ink, or if you were simply the anonymous shadow moving behind someone else's art. Either way, it felt like being part of something larger than your own sweat-streaked life. Historians still argue whether gondoliers were seen as lowly laborious or as semi-celebrities of the Venetian stage. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. You're invisible when passengers want privacy, yet essential when they want performance. You're mocked by children and admired by lovers. You're both servant and spectacle, shaping memories while your own story gets swallowed by the city's tides. The couple finally clambers out, coins pressed into your palm, their guidebook still clutched like a holy text. You watch them disappear into an alley, already calling their gondola ride the highlight of Venice. You shrug, half amused, half proud. They'll forget your face, but they'll remember the boat, the water, the city shimmering around them. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. The canal quiets for a stretch, until you decide to do something that never fails to draw attention. You open your mouth and sing. Your voice, roughened by salt air and late nights, rises over the splash of the oar and bounces off the stone walls. The melody is old, older than you, maybe even older than the gondola itself, one of those folk songs passed down like a family heirloom, carried by voices rather than parchment. Passengers always expect it. Some request it. A gondolier without a song is like a bakery without bread, technically possible, but profoundly disappointing. Historians still argue whether gondoliers truly serenaded passengers as often as paintings and novels suggest, or whether that was mostly fantasy embroidered later for tourists. You know the truth lies somewhere between. You don't sing all day, every day, but when you do, it matters. A song transforms a simple ride into theater, and theater into memory. The city itself seems to hush when you find the right note, the water rippling like a drum beneath you. Not every gondolier is blessed with a golden voice, though. Some croak like frogs in mating season. Others belt out tunes so loudly dogs start howling along the river. But the effort counts, and sometimes even bad singing gets better tips than silence. You once heard old Marco, whose voice sounded like two planks scraping together, serenade a group of German merchants who clapped so hard they nearly toppled into the canal. Maybe it was the wine, maybe it was the novelty, but Marco earned more in that hour than you did all week. You adjust your stance, letting the gondola glide, and drift into another tune. This one's lighter, a cheeky ballad about a girl from Murano who juggled lovers as easily as she juggled glass beads. Your voice isn't perfect, but it carries. A child leans from a balcony above, clapping along, while a woman hanging laundry shakes her head with a smile. For a moment, you're not just rowing, you're part of the city's soundtrack. There's a fringe tidbit about singing gondoliers that you find endlessly amusing. Some Venetian nobles, worried their wives might swoon for the gondoliers instead of them, supposedly tried to forbid too much serenading near their palaces. Whether the law was real or just rumor, you can imagine the scene perfectly: a red-faced noble shaking his fist at a gondolier mid-ballad, while his wife leans dreamily over the balcony. You grin at the thought. If true, it proves one thing. Your voice, however ordinary, carries power nobles couldn't entirely control. Singing also keeps you sane. Hours of rowing can numb the mind, each stroke of the oar blending into the next until you feel less like a man and more like part of the boat. A melody breaks that trance. It pulls you back into yourself, keeps your lungs working, your spirit awake. You've sung in storms, in fog, even while half asleep, and the sound has always steadied you. The canals may be unpredictable, but the rhythm of song remains. Of course, there's always competition. Gondoliers treat singing like dueling, each trying to outdo the others. You've had moments when you raised your voice in triumph, only to hear another gondolier on the next canal belt out a higher note, stealing the crowd's attention. It stings, but it also pushes you harder. A city this crowded doesn't allow silence for long. Someone is always ready to fill it. Passengers love the illusion that you sing just for them, but the truth is, you sing for everyone, for the balconies, for the bridges, for the stray cat curled on a windowsill. You sing for the city itself. Venice thrives on echoes, and your voice becomes one more layer in the endless conversation between water and stone. When the last note fades, you feel the air settle, almost reverent. Then, inevitably, life resumes: shouts from a fish cellar, laughter from a passing barge, the creak of shutters. The magic breaks, but not completely. For a little while, the melody lingers like perfume in the damp air. And as you press the oar back into the water, you think to yourself, maybe historians can argue all they like about whether gondoliers truly serenaded so much. You know what you've felt. You know what you've sung. And in this city, that's enough to make the story true. The sun climbs higher, and your stomach growls in rebellion. Romance and song may keep passengers happy, but they don't fill your belly. You steer your gondola back toward a familiar river, tie it up with a practiced knot, and wander into the maze of alleys in search of food. The streets buzz with midday life, vendors shouting prices, children chasing each other through narrow calles, and the occasional whiff of something frying that makes your mouth water. For a gondolier, lunch isn't a banquet. It's whatever you can get quickly, cheaply, and without risking indigestion that might make rowing miserable afterward. Most days it's a hunk of bread, a wedge of cheese hard enough to crack a tooth, and maybe a few olives wrapped in paper. If you're lucky, you score some dried sardines, salty, fishy, and just enough to trick your body into thinking you've eaten well. Historians still argue whether gondoliers in the 18th century had set meals or simply grazed like scavengers, but your gut knows the answer. It depends on the tips. Today you manage something better, a steaming plate of recitation, rice with peas, ladled out at a tavern for a few coins. It's not elegant, but it's warm, filling, and oddly comforting. You wolf it down at a wooden table while a cat eyes you suspiciously from the floor, waiting for scraps. A jug of cheap wine makes its way around the room, and you take a gulp, wincing at the sour bite. Venetian wine is rarely good, but it keeps your throat wet and your spirits just steady enough to face the rest of the day. The tavern hums with conversation. Merchants argue about tariffs, sailors brag about storms survived, and two young men debate which carnival mask attracts the prettiest women. You half listen, half daydream. Sometimes, in these moments, you wish for a life that didn't revolve around rowing strangers through canals. Maybe a shop, maybe a vineyard somewhere on the mainland. Then the cat swipes a paw at your bread crust, and reality returns. You're a gondolier, and tomorrow you'll still be a gondolier. There's a quirky trick most gondoliers know: eat standing up whenever possible. Why? Because if you sit too long, your legs stiffen, and then you climb back onto your boat wobbling like a drunk flamingo. You've learned to balance your plate on a barrel, shovel food in quickly, and keep moving. Today, though, the tavern chair feels too good to leave right away, and you allow yourself the small luxury of sitting until the rice is gone. Outside again, you nibble on a fig from a vendor's stall, juice running down your chin, sweet enough to make you forget the sour wine. The vendor winks, slipping an extra one into your hand payment, perhaps, for a ride you gave her uncle last week. Venice thrives on these little trades, favors passed back and forth until no one quite remembers who owes whom. Historians still argue whether gondoliers belonged firmly to the lower classes or if their constant proximity to nobles lifted them slightly above. You feel the tug both ways. Your food, your lodgings, your calloused hands scream common labour. But the fact that you dine at the same tavern where senators sneak in for a quiet drink reminds you that gondoliers float between worlds, slipping easily from humble to grand with the push of an oar. By the time you head back toward your gondola, the city smells of midday heat, salt, sweat, frying oil, and the faint tang of the lagoon. You chew the last bite of fig, brush crumbs from your striped shirt, and glance at the water waiting patiently for your return. Food in your belly, wine in your blood, you feel almost ready to face the afternoon rush. Almost. The truth is, no matter how well you eat, Venice always demands more from your body than you're willing to give. But with every stroke of the oar, you'll pay it back, one meal at a time. You step back onto the gondola with a heavier belly and a lighter purse, pushing away from the riva as afternoon sunlight begins to gild the water. The rhythm of rowing takes hold again, left foot planted, right hand steady on the forcola, the oar dipping into green water with the familiarity of a heartbeat. Afternoon is when Venice changes its tempo, markets quiet, nobles stir from their palaces, and visitors seek their leisure. And who guides that leisure? You. One of the peculiarities of your work is this: gondoliers are not just rowers but living tour guides, even if you don't carry maps or wear silly uniforms. A passenger steps into your gondola expecting more than transport. They want Venice explained, embellished, maybe even exaggerated. So, as you glide past the Doge's palace, you point with your chin and murmur something about its pink marble, adding a sly joke about how it looks like a fancy wedding cake that's been left out too long in the sun. They chuckle, and you know you've done your job. Historians still argue whether gondoliers truly invented the role of tour guide or if that was retrofitted later by travel writers who wanted to romanticize the city. But to you, the truth is obvious. Who else spends more time drifting slowly enough to notice the cracks in the Rialto Bridge or the carved lions crouching on palazzo steps? A sailor passes through too quickly, and a noble rarely looks beyond his own garden walls. Gondoliers, though, see it all. And in seeing it, you learn to narrate it. Of course, your commentary isn't always accurate. When a passenger once asked why a certain palace had windows shaped like pointed arches, you couldn't remember the proper term. So you claimed it was designed that way to keep out pigeons with big heads. They believed you. The truth that it was Venetian Gothic architecture, blending Byzantine and Islamic influences, was less amusing, and besides, who's checking? Your job isn't to teach a university course. It's to make the canals sparkle with story. There's a fringe tidbit you like to share when spirits are high. Supposedly, some gondoliers in the past were known to spill the city's secrets, carrying gossip from one palace to another in exchange for coin. In a city where whispers could make or break reputations, a gondolier's tongue might row as powerfully as his arm. Were they spies? Were they confidants? Historians still argue whether these stories are exaggerated, but you can't help but smile when passengers lean closer, hanging on every word you say, as if you too are smuggling secrets across the lagoon. Sometimes your tours include improvisation of the absurd. Passing under the Bridge of Sighs, you might whisper that every sigh echoing there adds 10 years of bad luck if you don't toss a coin into the canal. It's nonsense, but passengers clutch their purses nervously before dropping a coin, which you later fish out with a hook when no one's looking. Easy money, and no one ever complains. After all, they got a story. The afternoons often bring scholars, artists, or curious nobles who want to see the city from a gondolier's eye level. You've had painters sketching while you rode, their pages blotched with water droplets. You've had philosophers trying to explain theories of motion while you pretended to listen, though all you really heard was your own stomach demanding a second lunch. And once, you had a poet who insisted on composing aloud as you steered him through the canals, comparing your gondola to a floating cradle of the gods. You nearly snorted into the water but kept your face straight, the tip was generous. Being a guide isn't always glorious. Sometimes passengers demand too much dates, names, scandals, all recited as if you're an encyclopedia. You dodge by giving answers vague enough to sound mysterious. Ah, yes, this palace, its owner met a curious end. You don't say how. You don't say when. The silence you leave behind is often more thrilling than the truth. By the time afternoon shadows lengthen, you feel like you've told a dozen half-truths and a handful of tall tales, each one weaving you deeper into the mythology of Venice. And that's the strange thing, you don't just ferry people across water. You ferry them into imagination. Your gondola becomes both transport and theatre stage, with you as the star performer, though no one will ever put your name on a marquee. Still, as you watch the faces of your passengers light up at some ridiculous story you just invented, you realize the quiet truth. Without gondoliers, Venice would lose half its magic. Palaces and bridges can be admired in silence, yes, but the city only breathes when someone tells it aloud. And in that moment, you decide, whether you're a historian, a liar, or both, you're exactly what Venice needs to stay alive in memory. Afternoon fades into that lazy golden hour when the canals glow like molten glass, and you finally earn a brief reprieve. You guide the gondola to a quieter dock, secure it with a practiced twist of rope, and stretch your arms until your shoulders pop. Then, with a sigh that could rival any Bridge of Sighs, you saunter off toward the nearest Boccaro, a little wine bar tucked into an alley barely wide enough for two gondoliers to pass without dueling oars. Inside, the air smells of roasted peppers, vinegar, and humanity packed shoulder to shoulder. This is where gondoliers come not just to drink but to survive. A Boccaro is the gondolier's second home, dark wood counters sticky with spilled wine, shelves sagging under green glass bottles, and bowls of sacchetti, Venetian tapas, laid out like treasures. You grab a plateful, slices of polenta topped with anchovies, meatballs soaked in sauce, maybe even a fried zucchini flower if fortune smiles. You wash it down with a glass of ombra, the cheap local wine, its name meaning shadow, because vendors once sold it beneath the shadow of the campanile in San Marco. Historians still argue whether gondoliers fueled themselves more on wine or on sheer stubbornness, but judging by the roomful of striped shirts and raised glasses around you, the wine has a strong case. Conversations in a Boccaro follow their own rhythm, loud greetings, sudden laughter, and gossip spilled as freely as the wine. One man brags about the tip he earned from a French duchess who insisted he row slower so she could feel the romance. Another complains about a German merchant who haggled the fare as if gondolas were sacks of potatoes. Someone else swears he saw a sea monster in the lagoon last night, though by the slur in his words, the monster may have had more cork than scales. There's a fringe tidbit you've heard repeated often enough that it must hold a drop of truth. Gondoliers were once so numerous and unruly that the city tried to regulate their drinking, forbidding them to cluster in taverns during work hours. Of course, rules in Venice are like fishing nets, plenty of holes for slipping through. If you can't find a gondolier in the canals, you'll find him in a Boccaro, glass in hand, swearing he's just about to return to work. You sip, you snack, and you settle into the camaraderie. Here, you're not a performer or a servant or a tour guide. You're just another man leaning against the counter, belly pressed to the wood, elbows jostling neighbors who know the same aches in their backs and the same blisters on their palms. A gondolier's humor is sharp, often at his own expense. We row nobles by day and drink like nobles by night, someone declares, raising his glass. Except the nobles don't have to row again tomorrow. The room erupts in laughter. Sometimes the Boccaro even doubles as an impromptu hiring hall. A wealthy visitor might send a servant inside, scouting for a gondolier who looks sober enough to row them to the opera later. You've been chosen this way before, plucked from the warmth of wine and tossed back onto the water. It's a strange economy. Half of your livelihood comes from rowing, the other half from being in the right tavern at the right time. You lean back, chew on a skewer of grilled squid, and let your mind wander. Food and drink fill you, yes, but so does the chatter. These stories, half-truths though they may be, tie gondoliers together. Tomorrow, you'll repeat them to passengers, polishing them into entertainment. Today, you soak them up like bread in oil. Historians still argue whether the Boccaro culture of Venice was unique to gondoliers or shared across the city's working classes. You know the answer doesn't matter. What matters is the moment when the wine burns sweetly down your throat, the oil slicks your fingers, and the laughter rings so loud you forget the ache of the oar. Eventually, you toss a few coins onto the counter, nod at the barkeep, and stumble, just slightly, back toward the canal. The sun dips lower, painting the water copper. Work waits again, but for now, you're fortified. Not elegant, not noble, but perfectly Venetian, a man of water, wine, and whispered stories. Evening in Venice is a spectacle in itself, and you find yourself rowing once more, gondola gliding as lantern light flickers across the water. The air cools, carrying scents of roasting chestnuts and the faint musk of wet stone. Daytime passengers have mostly vanished back into palaces and taverns, replaced by a new crowd, those who wish to drift beneath the stars and pretend the city belongs only to them. For gondoliers, the evening crowd is both blessing and curse. On one hand, tips tend to be heavier. Lovers pay for romance, nobles pay for privacy, and visitors pay for novelty. On the other hand, nights can be long, cold, and punctuated by more than one passenger who mistakes your gondola for their personal confessional. You've heard more secrets whispered against the slap of the oar than you ever cared to know. Some involve love, some involve money, and one particularly drunk merchant once described in detail how he planned to smuggle a parrot across the border in a barrel of olives. Historians still argue whether gondoliers truly acted as keepers of the city's confessions, or if that's another myth embroidered by later romantics. You suspect the truth lies in the middle. You don't seek secrets, But Venice is a city of thin walls and thinner discretion. People whisper when they think the water won't tell, forgetting that the gondolier, steady at his post, hears everything. The lamps along the canals burn oil, their flames dancing in little cages of glass. Shadows ripple across walls, making palaces look alive. You row slowly, savoring the calm. A pair of passengers lean close, murmuring softly, the gondola rocking gently as if it, too, understands the mood. You bite back a smirk. Romance may not fill your own life, but you provide the stage for others. There's a quirky tidbit about Venetian nights you like to remember. Some gondoliers claimed they could navigate the canals in complete darkness by sound alone, the echoes of water against stone guiding them like invisible stars. You tried it once, closing your eyes for a few strokes, and nearly crashed into a laundry line strung across the canal. You decided then it's a talent best left to legends. Still, the city at night demands a slower rhythm. Rowing through the moonlit Grand Canal, you feel almost like part of a procession. Gondolas pass each other like silent dancers, nods exchanged between gondoliers who share the night's burdens. No one shouts, no one hurries. Even the water seems to hush itself, as if respecting the moon's authority. Sometimes the evenings bring music drifting from open windows, violins, lutes, even the occasional harpsichord played too enthusiastically. The sound floats down to the canals, wrapping itself around your oar strokes. Passengers sigh, imagining the music is meant for them, though you know it's just as likely a practice session gone wrong. Once, a singer's voice cracked so loudly mid-aria that your passengers burst into laughter, nearly tipping the gondola. You pretended not to notice, though inside you laughed just as hard. The evening crowd often tips better when serenaded, but after a few glasses of ombra from the Baccaro, your voice can be less than angelic. Still, you give them what they want, an old love ballad or a cheeky verse about carnival masks. They smile, they toss coins, and you remind yourself that music, even badly sung, buys bread. Historians still argue whether Venice's reputation as a city of romance was crafted by its gondoliers or whether gondoliers simply leaned into an existing myth. Either way, the result is the same. At night, you are not merely a ferryman. You are a magician, conjuring love with an oar and a song. By the time you dock again, stars shimmer above, reflected in the rippling black water. You feel the chill sink into your bones, but also the satisfaction of having ferried dozens of strangers through a dreamscape they'll never forget. For them, it was an evening's adventure. For you, it was another shift. But in the quiet of night, with lanterns winking and laughter fading into alleys, you can't help but admit you wouldn't trade this stage for any other. The night deepens, lanterns dim, and eventually you steer the gondola back to its mooring. Your arms ache from the day's work, your palms feel rough as old rope, and your legs wobble slightly when you step ashore. Yet the work doesn't quite end when the passengers leave. A gondolier must tend to his craft, for the gondola isn't just a boat, it's half your soul. You crouch low and run your hand along the hull. The black paint gleams faintly under the moonlight, though a closer look reveals chips where careless passengers knocked their rings or boots. A proper gondola demands constant care, scraping off algae, patching seams, polishing brass trim. Neglect it, and soon enough your boat will drag through water like a mule through mud. You know gondoliers who treat their boats as casually as rented mules, but you're not one of them. This vessel has carried your weight, your stories, your passengers' secrets, it deserves better. Historians still argue whether gondolas were originally painted black to symbolize solemnity or simply because the cheap pitch used for waterproofing left no other choice. Whatever the reason, the rule stands: black gondolas only, unless you're wealthy enough to bribe officials. You've sometimes wondered how ridiculous Venice would look if gondolas were painted in carnival colors, red, green, blue, like a floating bag of marbles. Beautiful, maybe. Chaotic, definitely. Inside the little compartment where passengers sit, You shake out crumbs of bread, dried wax from lanterns, and once, memorably, a wig left behind by a gentleman who must have realized too late he'd gone home bald. You polish the brass ferro, that curved iron prow that makes a gondola unmistakable. Its 6 horizontal bars represent the sestieri of Venice, or so everyone claims, though some whisper the design was just chosen because it looked impressive. Either way, it's the gondola's nose, and you keep it shining like a knight's sword. There's a quirky tidbit about maintenance passed down among gondoliers: spit works wonders on a stubborn stain. You scoff at it, but admit you've used the trick more than once, leaning over with a discreet hawk when no one's watching. Vinegar also does the job, but spit is cheaper and always on hand. As you work, you hear other gondoliers nearby, their voices carrying across the quiet water. Some hum, some curse at broken straps or cracked oars, and some already doze on the dock, hats pulled low over their faces. The community of gondoliers is a strange brotherhood, rivals on the canals, allies when the boats need tending. You've shared tools, borrowed nails, even swapped wood planks late at night, because in the end, the gondola must float or none of you make a living. Historians still argue how often gondoliers repaired their own vessels versus relying on the squarey, the specialized boatyards. Truth is, you do both. For minor cracks, a little pitch and patience suffice. For serious damage, you hand the boat over to craftsmen whose families have built gondolas for generations. They know the balance, the symmetry, the precise weight needed so one man can row alone without capsizing. You respect them, but you also know every moment your boat spends in their yard is a moment you're not earning. By the time you finish, your gondola gleams again, dark and sleek, ready for tomorrow. You coil the rope, check the forcola for splinters, and lean your oar against the dock. The day has drained you, but in the simple act of polishing wood and tightening straps, you feel restored. There's pride in this ritual. Venice may belong to the nobles and the merchants, but the gondola belongs to you. The moonlight glimmers across the canal, reflecting your boat like a shadow on the water. You pat the prow lightly, almost as if saying goodnight to an old friend. Then you straighten, stretch your sore back, and head toward your modest lodging. The city quiets around you, but inside your chest, the rhythm of the oar still beats, as if your body rose even in sleep. Your feet carry you away from the dock, through twisting alleys where the stones stay damp even in summer. You know these streets as well as the canals, every shortcut and crooked corner. Finally, you reach the building you call home. It isn't grand, not a palace, not even close. It's a weathered house leaning a little sideways, as if Venice itself couldn't decide whether to keep it upright. You climb narrow stairs worn into hollows by countless feet, push open a creaking door, and step into the world of the gondolier off duty. Inside, the air smells faintly of salt, wood smoke, and whatever your neighbor cooked hours ago. Your lodging is modest, but it's yours. A straw mattress, a wooden chest, a cracked jug of water, and maybe a stool if fortune has been kind. No velvet curtains, no chandeliers, no gilded mirrors. But after a day of rowing, the simplicity feels like luxury. You drop your striped shirt onto the stool, kick off your shoes, and sigh as your toes finally wiggle free. Historians still argue about the exact living conditions of gondoliers in the 18th century. Some sources insist many lived above stables or in shared rooms stacked with bunk beds. Others claim gondoliers with steady patrons could afford decent apartments in the sestieri. Your truth is somewhere in between, not squalor, but not splendor either. Just enough space to sleep, to eat, and occasionally to dream. You rummage in your chest and pull out a small keepsake, a shell from the Lido, worn smooth, that you pocketed years ago during a rare day off. It isn't worth a coin, but it reminds you the lagoon stretches farther than the canals, that the sea still waits beyond. Sometimes you hold it in your palm before sleep, imagining what life might be like in another port, another city. Then the mattress creaks beneath you, and the fantasy drifts away like smoke. A quirky tidbit about gondolier lodgings: some of you share space with animals. Cats, in particular, sneak in and claim corners, lured by scraps of fish and the warmth of straw. You don't mind them, better a purring cat than a rat gnawing the bread you hid under your pillow. Once, you woke to find a cat sprawled across your chest like a furry anchor, and you rode half the day still covered in its hairs. The room is never truly quiet. Through the thin walls, you hear neighbors bickering, laughing, or snoring like drowning trombones. From the street below drifts the cry of a late-night vendor, still hawking roasted chestnuts. Venice doesn't sleep easily, and so neither do you. But there's comfort in the noise, a reminder that you're part of the city's constant pulse. You splash water on your face from the jug, grit stinging your skin. No baths, no scented oils, just enough to wash off sweat and the faint stink of fish clinging to your shirt. Some gondoliers boast that they've bathed in the lagoon itself, though whether that counts as bathing or simply marinating is debatable. You've done it once, emerging slimy and smelling worse, and swore never again. Historians still argue whether gondoliers held any higher social status than dockworkers or fishermen, given their close proximity to nobles. You don't feel noble lying on your straw mattress, back aching and hands blistered. But you do feel part of something essential. Without gondoliers, the city would stall, its lifeblood clogged. The nobles may strut in brocade, but they still need someone to row them home at midnight. You blow out the stub of a candle, stretch across the mattress, and stare at the beams above. Sleep comes slowly after a day of labor, the rhythm of rowing still echoing in your muscles. You know tomorrow will be much the same: canals, passengers, songs, and secrets. But for now, in this quiet, crooked little room, you let the lagoon's distant hush cradle you like a lullaby. Morning again, though you've barely felt the night pass. The light that slips through the shutter is pale and watery, the kind that makes you groan and pull the blanket tighter. But a gondolier doesn't linger. If you're not out early, someone else will snag the best fares. You drag yourself up, stretch the stiffness from your limbs, and step back into the Venetian rhythm. Today feels different, though, because it isn't just another round of rowing strangers. Carnival season has arrived, and with it comes chaos. The streets hum with excitement, banners flap overhead, and masked figures already parade across bridges before breakfast. For a gondolier, carnival is both a headache and a blessing. Work multiplies, but so do the oddities. Historians still argue whether gondoliers played official roles in carnival festivities or were merely swept up in the frenzy. You know from experience, or at least, from tales passed down, that gondoliers became part of the spectacle, willingly or not. Masks meant anyone could step into your boat, nobles disguised as peasants, peasants disguised as nobles, lovers sneaking away in anonymity. And you, the gondolier, rode them all, never quite knowing who sat on your bench. You row past the piazza, where jugglers toss flaming torches, musicians pound drums, and children shriek beneath paper-make beasts. On the canals, it's even stranger. Boats dressed with garlands, gondoliers in costumes ranging from saints to demons. One of your companions once painted his gondola bright red for carnival and claimed it was a dragon. The authorities fined him later for breaking the black-only rule, but during the festivities, no one cared. There's a quirky tidbit about carnival and gondoliers. Some wore masks themselves, not to join the fun but to avoid recognition when ferrying questionable company. After all, a senator might not want it known he was rowed to a tryst across the lagoon. You imagine gondoliers laughing among themselves, trading stories of who they carried without ever saying names aloud. Secrets, after all, are currency. Today, a masked passenger steps into your gondola wearing a bird mask with a beak so long it nearly pokes your chest. They speak little, gesturing only where to go, and you row them silently through alleys draped in colored banners. You wonder who they are beneath the mask: a noble, a thief, A bored baker's apprentice borrowing someone else's costume? You'll never know, and that's part of the charm. The music of carnival drifts everywhere, pipes, fiddles, even the pounding of makeshift drums. You find yourself humming along as you row, caught up despite yourself. The air smells of fried sweets, frittole dusted with sugar, sold hot from vendors who tempt you even while you work. You promise yourself one later, though you know the line will be long and your purse thin. Historians still argue about the true origins of Venetian carnival, whether it was a celebration of freedom, a political distraction, or simply an excuse to indulge before Lent. To you, it hardly matters. What matters is that carnival transforms your ordinary labor into something wilder. For a few weeks, the canals feel less like work and more like theater, where every gondolier is part of a grand, chaotic play. As evening falls, lanterns flare brighter, and masked revelers spill wine into your gondola as they laugh too loudly to care. You row them anyway, adjusting your balance with every careless sway. It's exhausting, but profitable. And though you mutter under your breath about spilled wine and sore muscles, you can't deny the thrill of rowing through a city that feels alive in every corner, every mask, every echo of laughter bouncing off the stone. When at last you pause to rest, you realize your day was more than labor, it was witnessing history in motion, dressed in feathers and powdered wigs. And tomorrow, carnival will start again, louder and stranger, pulling you once more into its whirl. The storm arrives without ceremony, as storms in Venice often do. One moment you're leaning lazily on your oar, watching the sun sink in warm streaks across the lagoon, and the next, clouds roll in like an army, dark and swollen with intent. The first gust rattles your straw hat, nearly tossing it into the water, and you mutter that ancient gondolier's prayer, "May the wind be someone else's problem tonight." But no, this one's yours. The air thickens, heavy with brine and damp, and the canal ripples under your gondola like a restless animal. You know storms are part of the job, and you steady yourself, flexing your legs, gripping the forcola as though it could anchor you against nature itself. Historians still argue whether gondoliers truly mastered their craft by skill or by sheer stubbornness in weather like this, but you lean toward the second. Water slaps at the gondola's sides, the once playful lapping turning into harsh smacks. The boat tilts, and you shift instinctively, knees bent, body loose, just as your father, or some older gondolier whose name you've long forgotten, once taught you. Ride with the water, don't fight it. Easy advice, harder in practice, especially when rain needles your face and your shoes squelch with each step. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some gondoliers swore by charms to ward off lagoon tempests. A sprig of rosemary tied to the prow, a whispered chant to San Marco, even spitting over the left shoulder before pushing off. You never quite bought into it, but right now, with the sky crackling overhead and your gondola pitching like a drunk at carnival, you wish you'd tucked a rosemary branch in somewhere. The storm sharpens your senses. You hear the creak of wood, the roar of wind through narrow alleys, the slap of shutters hastily closed. Somewhere, a bell tolls, muffled by rain but insistent. Your gondola bucks again, and you curse softly, imagining yourself dumped into the murky depths, rowing for eternity as a soggy ghost. Cheery thought, isn't it? You fight the current, pushing toward a stone landing where you might hunker down until the worst passes. Your arms ache, shoulders burn, but you keep at it, lungs gulping damp air. The rain blurs everything into smudges of grey and gold lantern light, but you cling to what you can see, the bob of another gondola ahead, its own gondolier bent double in effort. You're not alone in the fight, though that's cold comfort. Historians still argue whether Venice's resilience against the elements was brilliance or recklessness. The city shouldn't stand at all, perched on wood pilings in a lagoon. Yet here it is, centuries of storms endured, buildings sagging but stubborn, just like you on this rain-soaked night. You're a speck against forces larger than yourself, but you keep rowing anyway, because that's what gondoliers do. Finally, You wedge the gondola against a quieter bank, water calmer here between protective walls. You slump down, soaked through, chest heaving, rain dripping from your hat brim. Relief floods you, though your hands tremble from the adrenaline. The storm isn't over, you still hear thunder rolling like drums across the lagoon, but you've survived the worst of it. You always do. A final joke sneaks into your weary thoughts. When they tell stories of brave gondoliers battling storms, no one ever mentions the part where you sit afterward, shivering, shoes squishing like drowned loaves of bread. But maybe that's for the best. Heroics sound better without the soggy details. The storm clears, leaving the city rinsed clean. Lanterns glimmer on slick cobblestones, their light doubled in the puddles, and the air feels scrubbed of soot and spice. You push away from the sheltered landing, gondola dripping like a wet cat, and row slowly through water that has settled back into gentle sighs. The quiet after chaos is its own kind of music. But peace never lasts long in your world. Rival gondoliers are already back on the canals, staking their territories with shouts and gestures, the competition as sharp as ever. You pass one leaning arrogantly against his forcola, giving you a look that says, "You took my fare last week." Another crosses close, forcing you to steady your balance, and mutters a warning about sticking to your own bridges. Historians still argue whether gondoliers truly operated like a brotherhood or more like rival gangs. You've seen both. On some days, there's solidarity, helping each other when a boat tips, or sharing a bottle of cheap red on a quiet afternoon. On others, there's sabotage, oars mysteriously misplaced, a gondola nudged into a less favorable mooring, even whispers spread to keep a rival from attracting high-paying passengers. A quirky tidbit: it's said gondoliers once had their own informal courts, where disputes were settled by rowing contests, singing battles, or, more rarely, by fists on the nearest pier. The stories don't always end in dignity, more often in bruises and hangovers, but the code of the canals is as real as any law passed in the Doge's palace. Tonight, you navigate this invisible battlefield carefully. You nod where needed, scowl when expected, and avoid staring too long at the gondolier who's been eyeing your best landing spot near the piazza. It's a dance of respect and rivalry, one you've learned by instinct more than rule. Still, even in competition, there's a strange camaraderie. You know the other gondoliers' voices by sound alone, recognize their strokes in the water. If one of them were to fall ill mid-journey, odds are you'd row his passenger safely to shore, even if you'd grumble about it after. You live in the same rhythm, share the same blisters, breathe the same lagoon air. As the night deepens, you lean your weight into each push of the oar, feeling the day's fatigue settle into your bones. The city has quieted again, carnival masks tucked away, storm clouds fled, the air filled now with the soft hum of lullabies from distant windows. You're part of it all and yet apart, guiding your gondola beneath bridges that have seen centuries of men like you come and go. Historians still argue whether the gondolier's life was enviable freedom or endless toil. Perhaps it's both. You row when you wish, but you're bound to the water, your fate tied to the oar as surely as any sailor to his mast. And yet, when the canals mirror the moon, and your boat glides soundlessly through an alley where every shadow feels like a secret, you know there's no place else you'd belong. The day blurs to its end. You tie off the gondola, run your hand along the damp wood, and step onto the stone with aching legs. Another day finished, another to follow. Your life is not one of grandeur, but of rhythm, the rise and fall of tides, the laughter and arguments of passengers, the rivalries and friendships of men who live and die by the water. And as the city exhales into silence, you realize that yours is just one story among countless gondoliers, all of you rowing through history together, oars cutting the same eternal current. Now the journey softens, as all nights must. The storm is gone, the rivalries fade, and the gondola rests quietly, tethered to the stone where it belongs. The water smooths into a gentle mirror, and the city exhales into sleep. The noise of carnival is only a memory, the masks tucked away, the laughter folded into silence. You breathe slower now, the salt air cool against your skin. The canals stretch like ribbons beneath the moon, calm, steady, timeless. Your body loosens, the tension of rowing released, muscles surrendering to rest. The city itself seems to cradle you, every arch and balcony leaning inward as if to whisper that you've done enough for one day. Your thoughts drift, no longer sharp, no longer hurried. You think of lantern light reflected on black water, of bread warm from the morning ovens, of voices that rose and fell like music across the canals. You think of storms survived, of masks that hid secrets, of rivalries that kept the night alive. All of it softens into a haze, as if the city folds the memories into itself, keeping them safe while you let go. Now the rhythm slows. The water laps gently against the gondola, steady and predictable, a sound as old as Venice itself. It is the lullaby of the lagoon, the heartbeat of your days, the quiet assurance that life will continue tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. So let the canals fade now into darkness, the oar slip from your hand, and the city's breath carry you into sleep. You've rowed enough. The night is yours. The dream is waiting.